So everyone talks about diversity in fiction, but what could be more diverse than sci-fi and fantasy? These are big tent genres where everybody is welcome, especially non-humans. So if you're working on your next sci-fi or fantasy novel, you might want to include some non-human characters, whether they're elves, aliens, or something totally original. So here's how to write a fictional species completely from scratch. First thing you should think about is their habitat and adaptations. When you're inventing a fictional species, their natural habitat is a good place to start. A species is going to adapt to its environment or face extinction, and yours isn't going to be any different. You can get a lot of ideas about their physiology by considering what adaptations would be beneficial in that environment. You'll be writing a species whose traits aren't arbitrary, but biologically sensible. For example, in my own sci-fi novel, The Aetherverse, the alien Vehicipin species, which is obviously fictional, they're described as dwelling in mangrove swamps. I even show a planet like that in one of the accompanying short stories, Warriors of Vega. But the Vehicipin are well suited for that environment. They have a semi-autonomous set of tendrils that they use to propel themselves through the water, and their vision functions within the infrared spectrum, so they can see through the dark and murky waters of those swamps. And you can invent your own fictional organs and senses that will allow your species to thrive in its natural environment. Maybe they have specialized respiratory organs to filter out a toxic atmosphere, or they have some kind of exoskeleton that shields them from radiation. Whatever adaptations you come up with, you can create a convincing sci-fi or fantasy species by using their habitat as a foundation. Okay, and then the second thing you should think about is their life cycle. Now that you know your creature's physiology, you can start thinking about their life cycle. All living creatures grow from immaturity to adulthood, and yours probably will too. First, think about their average lifespan. Do they live for a few centuries? Are they immortal? Or do they only live a couple of years like a bug? If you're not sure, then go back to their environment again. An environment that has a lot of predators or really scarce resources is likely going to result in shorter lifespans. And I don't mean, oh, they get eaten quickly, but they've just evolved to have shorter lifespans as a survival mechanism. The survival of the species, that is. On the other hand, a stable environment is going to encourage longer lifespans. But once you know how long they live, you can start planning their development accordingly. It might be like humans and get secondary sex characteristics later on, or maybe they're like butterflies and they go through metamorphosis. When I'm thinking about something like this, I think of the xenomorphs from the Alien franchise. They have a really interesting life cycle where it's like a endoparasitoid or something like that. They start as an egg, and then from that emerges the facehugger stage of their life cycle, and then they implant an egg into the body of their host, which then explodes from their chest into a full-grown xenomorph, which then carries on the cycle again. If you're a sci-fi author, you might want to do something similar and have something that alien and that strange. Ultimately, think about how your species is going to procreate. It can be as conventional or bizarre as you want, okay? And then the third thing you should think about is associated species. A species rarely exists in isolation. Whether they're food, threats, or friends, other creatures will somehow be involved. While you don't have to fully plan out these side species, you might want to at least give them some thought. Your species might have a symbiotic relationship with others, or it might be under constant threat of extermination by another. Going back to the alien Vehicipin in my sci-fi novel that I had mentioned, I describe it's just in a bonus content article on my website, it's not in the book, but I describe that they have a symbiotic relationship with this particular species of bog algae. Basically, the algae live on the bodies of the Vehicipin, and they produce this kind of viscous biofilm that covers them, and this protects them from environmental toxins. The Vehicipin, by allowing these algae to exist on their bodies and dwell there, protects the algae from predation by carrying them on their bodies. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So your species is going to have its own relationship with other life forms. Think about which species yours is going to treat as food, which are its natural predators, and which ones are helpful for their survival. Again, it's not necessary to invent anything other than a name and some basic attributes, but these associated species will add more complexity and turn your fictional environment into a believable ecosystem. Okay, and then the fourth thing you should think about is communication. All living things communicate to some extent. A sentient creature is likely going to have a very structured and complex form of language, while a simpler species might use visual or chemical signals to communicate. In the Aetherverse, the crystallines communicate using a binary language of electrical impulses, while the Caspians and the Hijan have more conventional spoken languages. And then there's the alien Procyon, who have a fully telepathic language. But regardless of the nature of this language or its complexity, the ability to communicate is an invaluable survival tool. And for your own species, you don't need to invent a fully functional constructed language for them. You don't need to go as far as I did, because I'm just really, really dorky and nerdy when it comes to languages like that. But you don't have to do that. If they do use a spoken language, you can come up with a couple of words or basic phrases that you can sprinkle into your dialogue. If you do that though, just make sure your readers can understand it from context. However, if you do decide that you want to dabble in some conlanging for your novel, I have some resources on my website on how to get started with that. So I'll put the links in the description. Constructed languages may not be necessary for a sci-fi or fantasy story, but it can certainly enhance a fictional universe and the creatures that call it home. Okay, and then the fifth thing you should think about is their behavior and experience. Of all the details you're going to invent, I think this is the most interesting. All life forms have unique behaviors, but what's really fascinating is the internal experience of higher life forms. We talk about the human experience and what it means to be human, to love, to hurt, to hope for something greater. These are subjective experiences that only humans will know, and we all share them in one way or another. Your fictional species is going to have its own set of shared experiences. Their behavior and experience are even more important if you plan on including one of them as a point of view character in your novel. Readers are always drawn into the character's experiences, and what could be more interesting than seeing the world through non-human eyes? Think about what would be important to your species, what kinds of challenges they might face in life, and how they view the world around them. Their lives should be just as meaningful as those of your human characters, and you want your readers to feel the same way. Anyway, my point is that sci-fi and fantasy worlds are diverse. A hallmark of the sci-fi and fantasy genres is their inclusion of all sorts of fantastic creatures, the likes of which your readers may never have seen before. And while you might not use all the details of your fictional species in your novel, it's a fun exercise in world building to invent creatures to populate your universe. You can post these descriptions as bonus articles on your website, or you can include it in your novel as an appendix if you'd like. But no matter how you decide to use them, your creations will enhance the already complex story you've written. You'll give your readers a living world that's just as diverse as our own. So yeah, if you're a sci-fi or fantasy author and you've ever invented a fictional species, like you didn't decide to just go with elves or some sort of alien that is common in sci-fi, I don't know, I can't think of one, but you made up your own, one completely from scratch, put it in the comments because I would be interested to see what kinds of things people come up with. And like I mentioned earlier, if you were interested in some conlanging for your species or for your sci-fi or fantasy novel, then check out the links that I put in the description. If you found it interesting or helpful, please like and subscribe, follow me on social media, and as always, thank you for watching. God bless.